The most important problem in the biological sciences in the present era is a problem that until quite recently most scientists didn't think was a suitable topic for scientific investigation at all. The problem is just this: how exactly do brain processes cause consciousness? Now, on our current theories, we think the functional unit is the neuron, and particularly the points where the neurons communicate with each other, the synapses. So given that model, the question would be, how exactly do neuron firings at synapses cause all of our conscious life? Now, it's an important thought, one we've had in earlier lectures. It's an important thing to keep in mind that the enormous variety of our experiences, everything that happens to us, all of the input stimuli that we get, are converted into this common medium, variable rates of neuron firings at synapses, and those variable rates of neuron firings cause all of the enormous variety of our conscious life, whether or not it's the blue of the sky or the taste of the wine or the reminiscences of your childhood. All of those conscious experiences are caused at the level of neurons at synapses, at least as far as we know. Now, you might think, well, if that's a scientific problem, why don't these guys just get on with it and solve it? And I think in the end, that will be the right approach. But unlike most scientific problems, this one is loaded with philosophical confusions. There are a rather large number of philosophical obstacles to getting an adequate account of consciousness. And in this lecture, I'm going to try to remove some, and in fact, I hope most of those obstacles. And what I'm going to do is list 9 difficulties, 9 objections, 9 problems that there are in getting a scientific account of consciousness. And to lead into that, I want to mention 3 overriding assumptions that we tend to make that I think are mistaken and that give rise to the 9 problems I'll mention. The first assumption is the one that we've been combating throughout these lectures, and that is dualism, the idea that mental and physical name mutually exclusive realms. As long as we think that, as long as we think, well, they really don't connect with each other, the mind and the body, then we're not going to be able to get a scientific account. A second mistake that we're persistently inclined to make is this contrast between machines and nature, and the feeling that somehow or other machines are not natural phenomena, that there has to be a deep contrast. This comes out whenever somebody invents a new program to play chess. In one of the recent ones, there was a huge outpouring in the newspapers about, oh, wouldn't it be awful if we built a computer that could beat the best human chess players. Why? What's so bad about that? I mean, wouldn't it be a threat to our dignity? I don't feel my dignity is threatened when I see a steam shovel that can dig faster than any human, or a pocket calculator that can do addition, and subtraction faster than even the world's best mathematician. It's just what we do as living, thinking machines is create dumb, unconscious machines that enable us to do a whole lot of things that we couldn't do otherwise. I don't find our ability to create machines that behave as if they were intelligent. No, I notice I say as if they were intelligent. I don't find our ability to create such machines somehow or other a threat to our dignity. But the idea that we do that, where would we ever get such a crazy idea? It's because I think we're contrasting ourselves with machines, and we somehow or other feel maybe the machines are a threat. Maybe they're threatening to us. The third general overriding mistake is one I've mentioned briefly earlier, but we're going to see in this lecture it rears its head again and again, and that is the failure to make the distinction between those features of nature that are really there, independent of us, the features of nature that are observer independent, that would exist if we all died, if all humans beings ceased to exist, those features of nature such as gravitational attraction, force, photosynthesis. Well, if you take away all plants, you wouldn't have photosynthesis. But those features of nature that are independent of any sort of human consciousness, what I call intrinsic, need to be distinguished from features like computation, money, government, marriage, and the use of objects to perform functions, such as being a knife or being a chair, which, as I said in earlier lectures, are observer relative. We're going to see that distinction come up again in this lecture. Okay, with all of that by way of introduction then, what are the problems with getting a scientific account of consciousness? What sort of mistakes are we making? And I think the best way to do this is just give a list of the dumbest mistakes I can think of. And then first I'll list the mistakes, and then I'll go through and try to correct them. Now, I have to tell you in advance, this isn't stuff I thought up sitting in my study. These are things that people have actually said to me. All of these mistakes are actually made by important philosophers and scientists in the field. So it's not an abstract intellectual exercise here. I think this actually has practical significance. I think we won't get an adequate science of consciousness until we overcome these challenges. Number one, it is often said you don't even have an adequate definition of consciousness. There's no scientifically adequate definition. We don't even know what we're talking about. The whole notion is ill-defined. We can't even get a handle on what the problem of consciousness is because nobody has given us a satisfactory definition of consciousness. That's, as I said, I'm going to list. I'm not going to answer these things. I'm going to resist the temptation to answer them on the spot. I'm going to come back after I have stated the problems or the what I think of as mistakes, and then come back and try to answer each question. Number two, whatever else is true of consciousness, it's subjective. You're talking about people's subjective experiences. But science is objective. Science is by definition objective. So you got a kind of syllogism here. Consciousness is subjective, science is objective, therefore there can be no science of consciousness. Whatever else consciousness is, it's not a suitable subject for scientific investigation. The third objection: if you tried to investigate consciousness scientifically, you really go to work and try to figure out how the neuron firings cause these mysterious, touchy-feely, airy-fairy conscious states, you couldn't do it because there's no way you can ever get over the hump from neuron firings to feelings. I mean, I now have a very particular human sensation that we've all experienced thousands of times, the taste of water. Now, if you did a study of all my neuron firings when I tasted water, how are you supposed to get from the neuron firings to the feelings? I mean, this is what Dave Chalmers calls the hard problem. And you remember we mentioned Tom Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat. It's the problem of trying to get from the bat's neurophysiology to the bat's feelings. And some philosophers like Colin McGinn have said, forget it, we'll never get the answer to that question. We couldn't possibly understand the link between the brain and feeling, because how are you supposed to show that the feeling is a natural consequence of neuron firings? There just isn't any connection between neuron firings and feelings, so we're never going to be able to explain that. A fourth problem, a fourth objection, and this comes up more often than you might suppose. I was surprised to find this in actual practicing scientists. A fourth objection is this: if you were going to do a science of consciousness, you'd have to take this sort of qualitative touchy-feely stuff, the so-called qualia, and put them off on one side. If a serious science of consciousness couldn't spend any time on the qualia part of consciousness, they need to be moved over to one side so we can concentrate on the really serious problems, on those that are subject to scientific treatment. Now, I wouldn't have believed that anybody could say that, but I found something like that in two very important books. One by Francis Crick, The Astonishing Hypothesis, where Crick tries to advance a theory of consciousness, and he's very dismissive about qualia. And another one, a book by Gerald Edelman called Bright Air, Brilliant Fire, and that's a successor to his earlier book, The Remembered Present. And in both of those books, Edelman is also somewhat dismissive about qualia, as if, well, we need to solve the serious scientific problem of consciousness, but don't worry about qualia. All right, well, we're going to come back to that. Now, a fifth problem I have mentioned briefly in earlier lectures, and that's this. Even if we did get a science of consciousness, the most it could show would be that consciousness doesn't matter, that it is epiphenomenal, that it's just, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, it's just like the froth on the wave. It doesn't actually make any difference. And epiphenomenalism is alive and well. I mean, there are lots of people who believe it. Again, in the book I mentioned by David Chalmers, Chalmers says, look, if we believe that our consciousness makes a difference to our behavior, we're just mistaken. If you think that you ate because you felt hungry, or you pulled your hand out of the fire because you felt a pain, or you married your spouse because you were consciously in love, that's all an illusion. Consciousness couldn't make any of those differences. In fact, Chalmers, you got to give him credit for courage. He says, I might think I wrote this book because I had a lot of conscious opinions I wanted to convey, but wait a second, writing a book's a physical event like any other, so it has to have entirely physical causes. So my writing this book about consciousness can't be causally explained by consciousness, because consciousness can't have any causal effects. That's courageous epiphenomenalism. Okay, where are we up to? About number 6? Number 6 is this. Even if there were such a thing as consciousness, the way some of these philosophers talk about it, it wouldn't have any evolutionary function, because we can easily imagine that there are beasts just like us, but they have no consciousness. So it looks like whatever else consciousness is good for, it has no evolutionary role, because it's very easy to imagine people who have all of our selectional advantages without consciousness. It's perfectly possible to imagine a world in which the selectional advantages that enabled human beings to survive and prosper are present, but without any consciousness at all, so it seems there's no evolutionary function of consciousness. An 8th question, I'm up to a 7th. A 7th question is this. If it's really the case that there is a causal relation between brain processes and consciousness, then it looks like you've got dualism. Because what are you going to say? If you're going to say, look, there's the brain process as cause and consciousness as the effect, then you've got a dualistic distinction between the material cause and the psychological effect, between the physical cause and the mental effect. And we all know what that is. That's dualism. Maybe it would be property dualism, maybe it's substance dualism, but whatever it is, it's bad news. Because if we got one lesson that we've learned in the past 300 years, is that dualism doesn't work. It's a very unsatisfactory theory. So if you've got a theory that implies dualism, you're in some kind of deep trouble. An 8th question, or an 8th problem, is this. If we had a science of consciousness, it would have to be reductionistic. because that's what science is. Science is reductionistic. The way that science explains something like solidity or liquidity or life or sunsets is by reducing it to something else. So the most the science of consciousness could do would be to get rid of consciousness by really showing that it's really just something else, really just neuron firings or some quantum mechanical phenomena. There are different theories. But whatever theory of consciousness we have, it's going to get rid of consciousness because it's going to be reductionistic. And the final one we've seen before, but it has a special role to play in this discussion, and that's our old friend, information processing. And the idea here is, look, any account of consciousness is going to be an information processing account, so it's going to show us that consciousness can be reduced to standard forms of information processing. For example, of a kind that we've talked about earlier, the kind of information processing that goes on in computational systems. Okay, that's quite a heavy menu for one lecture, but let's do it. Let's just go through those questions. First, the definition of consciousness. We need to distinguish common sense definitions whose purpose is just to identify a subject matter from analytic definitions that tell us about the essence, the essential traits of the subject matter we've identified. Now, analytic definitions come at the end of a scientific investigation, not at the beginning. But at the beginning, we want a common sense definition that will enable us to know what we're talking about. So consider the definition of water. Water is standardly defined as a colorless, tasteless liquid of the sort that falls in rainstorms and flows in rivers and exists in lakes and oceans. That's the common sense definition. I looked it up in a dictionary, and that's in fact what they say. But then they also give the analytic definition, water is H2O. Now notice, the fact that water is H2O, that's a much later discovery. We all have a common sense definition of water before we ever get the chemical analysis that enables us to give the scientific analytic definition. Same goes for consciousness. It's easy to give a common sense definition of consciousness. I'll do it. Conscious states are those subjective states of sentience or awareness that begin in the morning when you wake from a dreamless sleep and continue throughout the day until you fall asleep again or go into a coma or die or otherwise become unconscious. Dreams are a form of consciousness, though they're different and generally at a much lower level of intensity than waking consciousness. But any one of these subjective, inner, qualitative states of feeling or sentience or awareness, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about consciousness. It's not a difficult problem. It's not a difficult phenomenon to identify. It's just that having said that, we now want to go to work and get an analytic definition, not just be satisfied with this common sense definition. So the first difficulty, I think, is not a serious one. How about the second one? Conscious states are by definition subjective. Science is objective, so there can be no science of consciousness. Now, there's a very interesting pun on the objective-subjective distinction in that, and it's very important not just for this issue, but for philosophy in general. We need to distinguish an epistemic sense of the objective-subjective distinction. Remember, epistemology means the theory of knowledge. We need to distinguish a sense that has to do with how we know. We need to distinguish that sense from an ontological sense. Ontology has to do with what exists. We have to distinguish the epistemic sense of the objective-subjective distinction from the ontological sense, and I'll illustrate both of those. Suppose I say Rembrandt was born in 1606. Now, don't quote me on that. I think that's right, but anyway, around then. Rembrandt was born in 1606. That is an objective fact. That's epistemically objective. We can settle that. But if I say Rembrandt was a better painter than Rubens, I think that's right. But that, as they say, is a matter of subjective opinion. That's a matter of my opinion, and there are people whose opinions I respect, not very many, but there are some, who would disagree with me about that. So there we've got a distinction between the epistemically objective and the epistemically subjective. But now notice that's a different question from the question of what exists. Mountains and molecules and waterfalls and tectonic plates have an objective mode of existence in that their existence doesn't depend on being experienced by any subject. But pains and tickles and itches exist only as experienced by some human or animal subject. Therefore, they have a subjective mode of existence. Now, the bottom line of this is simply the following. There is a domain that is ontologically subjective, pains and feelings and consciousness generally, that admits of a science which is epistemically objective. To nail this down to actual cases, I happen to have a lower back pain. If many of you don't, you probably will. Eventually, most people get it. I mean, the only comfort to having this is the knowledge that 80% of the population's either got them or going to have them. Okay, now it's just an objective fact in the epistemic sense that I've got this lower back pain, but the pain itself has an ontologically subjective mode of existence. To put this in words of one syllable, in one sentence, the fact that consciousness is ontologically subjective doesn't prevent us from getting a science which is epistemically objective. It's a simple pun. Okay, but now how do you get over the hump? And I think this is the most serious of these questions. How could we get a science of consciousness that would show why and how neuron firings cause feelings? You know, it's not enough just to get a correlation. I mean, even if we had a correlation between neuron firings and feelings, I mean, Francis Crick thinks it's neuron firings of 40 hertz that are neurally correlated with consciousness. But even if that were right, I mean, it would be tremendous if that turned out to be right. Even if we're right, that still wouldn't be enough. We want to know, what's the theory? Why do the neuron firings give rise to the conscious states? See, think of it this way. We have a perfect correlation between lightning and thunder, but you don't have a theory. You don't have a satisfactory scientific explanation. When you just say lightning and thunder are correlated, you got to show how and why the lightning causes the thunder. Now, similarly, it's not enough to get a correlation between the neuron firings and the feelings. We've got to show how and why neuron firings give rise or cause feelings. And the objection goes, not only do we not have a theory of that, we don't even know what a theory would look like. I mean, it would take a major scientific revolution to get us a theory of how and why neuron firings could give rise to subjective feelings of awareness. Now, I think this is a serious problem, and I think we don't have an adequate theory of how it could work, but I'm not as pessimistic as people like Colin McGinn and Thomas Nagel. Why not? Well, there are two things I want us to keep in mind. One is, we know it happens, right? We know that your brain processes affect your consciousness. Anytime you have any doubts about that, just drink a big glass of scotch, and you will discover, yes, that when the stuff hits your brain, it definitely affects your consciousness. We know it happens. We know that brain processes do it, and if it happens, it ought to be able for us to figure out how it happens. Now, that's the first point. The second point is this. We've been in this situation before in the history of science. As recently as 100 years ago, our great-grandparents had a huge battle about life. And the question was, could you explain life in chemical terms? How could you give an explanation of life just in these mechanical terms? And a lot of people thought, you can't do it. You got to postulate a kind of life spirit in order to explain how matter can be alive. You got to postulate an élan vital, Sounds better in French. And the whole idea was that we would never get a chemical account of life. Well, now we can't even recover those issues. Now it just seems obvious to us that we have a biochemical account. And that is not because the mechanists, as they were called, won the battle and the vitalists lost. That's what happened. But more deeply because we got a much richer theory of the mechanisms. We now have a conception of biochemistry that's vastly richer than anything that was available 100 years ago. And today we can't even feel the force of the debate that went on a century ago. Another example, electromagnetism. If in the history of science, if you remember how Newtonian mechanics gave a very simple account of the universe with a rather limited number of laws, but there was a mysterious and puzzling feature, and that was electromagnetism. I mean, those magnetic filings just didn't look like Newtonian objects. They didn't look like the planetary system, for example, and it seemed spooky. It seemed really mysterious that there should be such thing as electromagnetism. But then Clerk Maxwell came with his equations, and now it's just another scientific theory. So I'm suggesting that though it is a serious question, how brain processes could cause consciousness, it's not impossible that we can get an answer to it. One, because we know that it happens, and two, it looks much like previous mysteries in the history of knowledge, where we solve the mystery by getting a more adequate theory. Okay, but that takes us to our fourth problem. Shouldn't we push the qualia off on one side? Shouldn't we, in a hard-nosed science of consciousness, why do we have to mess around with these touchy-feely qualitative states? Can't we have a science of consciousness which just leaves out the qualia? Now, as I said, I wouldn't have thought this was a serious approach to the problem at all if I hadn't seen it in the works of important neurobiologists. So let me just answer it very simply. You cannot separate the problem of qualia from the problem of consciousness, because conscious states are qualia. That's it. I mean, if you take away the qualia, there's nothing left over. When we talk about consciousness, we're talking about these qualitative, subjective states of sentience or awareness. Now, you can talk about different aspects of them and not talk about their subjectivity or their qualitative character, but the fact is, conscious states are qualia right down to the ground. There's no way you can set the problem of qualia on one side and still talk about consciousness, because that's what consciousness is, qualitative states. All right, but now then, how do we deal with the problem of epiphenomenalism? Well, I've discussed that in earlier lectures, and I won't say much about it except to expand on what I've said earlier as it relates to this particular issue. Why would we think consciousness is epiphenomenal? I think it's the same reason as the reason we think there's some special metaphysical difficulty about showing how neuron firings can explain consciousness, and that is we're still in the grip of dualism. We're still in the grip of the dualistic categories. It's very hard to shake that. We all are brought up on it. It's part of our popular culture. It's very hard to shake the assumption that the mental and the physical name two different categories. Our whole culture is permeated with the idea that there's a special class of mental illness, which is somehow different from physical illness. I can remember once being seasick on a boat, and a woman told me, "It's all in your mind." Well, that's not much help. I mean, I'm still sick. But this assumption that somehow or other the mind is really different from the body is what gives rise to this illusion that the mind can't make a physical difference. And the way that I have been describing it, we should not think that there is this special metaphysical category, the mental. It's just because of its intrinsic mental qualitative character, conscious states are higher level features of the brain. And I want to use an expression here I haven't used before. They are emergent properties. An emergent property is one that is explained by the behavior of the lower level elements, but is not itself a property of any of those elements. So in the harmless sense in which liquidity and solidity are emergent properties of systems of molecules, even though no individual molecule is liquid or solid, in that sense consciousness is an emergent property of the behavior of neurons, and the system of neurons explains consciousness even though no individual neuron is conscious. But once we see that, then it seems to me consciousness is no more epiphenomenal than any other higher level property. It's like the solidity of the piston or the liquidity of the water. I can't wash myself in the water or take a bath in it or drink it if it's not liquid. So the liquidity is not epiphenomenal, though of course the liquidity is completely explained by the behavior of the molecules, in the same way that the consciousness of my brain plays a causal role in my life. I couldn't be giving this lecture if I wasn't conscious, even though the consciousness is itself completely explained by the behavior of the neurons and the synapses and is a feature of the system. It's realized in the system that consists of those neurons and synapses. But now we get to our sixth question. What about the evolutionary role? Isn't it just a kind of evolutionary hangover, this touchy-feely stuff? Because you could easily imagine a world with people like us who were total zombies, who marched around and gave their lectures and paid their income tax and drove their cars, but were totally unconscious. What do you need consciousness for if you're an evolutionary biologist? Now, that is a weird thing to say if you think about it. I mean, it's such a very strange claim to make. And you have to remind yourself, what are the rules by which we play the game of asking ourselves, what is the selectional function? What's the advantage? What's the selectional advantage of some phenotypical trait? Now, I want to suggest that a basic rule is you've got to hold the rest of nature constant. Let me give you some examples of that. Suppose somebody says, well, what's the function of birds' wings? Well, obviously, for most species of birds, it enables them to fly, and that gives them an advantage. They can avoid predators and so on in a way they couldn't if they couldn't fly. Now, there's much more to be said. According to some theories, the earliest wings were kind of stubs that functioned to keep the animal warm, and they evolved into these flying mechanisms. But notice, we wouldn't accept it if somebody said, well, that can't be right, because you can easily imagine birds that didn't have wings that flew just as well. They use rocket engines, let's say, or something like that. Well, that's crazy, because the way that we play the game of evolutionary biology, the rules of the procedure are that you have to assume that nature is constant. You can't say, look, the function of photosynthesis can't be to provide the plant with food, because you could easily imagine a world in which when the plants needed food, they went around the corner to a McDonald's and bought a hamburger. Well, you could imagine that as science fiction, but that's not how nature works. Now, similarly, I want to say, if you're asking, what is the evolutionary function of consciousness? Well, almost everything we do is conscious. All the interesting things of what we do. Walking, fleeing, fighting, procreating, raising our children, finding food, organizing societies, engaging in communication with each other. All of those are conscious activities. And it doesn't make any sense to think, well, imagine those going on without consciousness any more than it makes sense to say we can easily imagine birds flying without wings. You can imagine that as a science fiction fantasy, but in real life you have to assume nature is held constant when you ask what is the evolutionary function of something. And if anything, with the result of this, that consciousness has vastly too many evolutionary functions. So to ask what is the evolutionary function of consciousness is almost like asking what's the evolutionary function of being alive. You can't evolve if you're not alive. And human beings like ourselves couldn't evolve if we weren't conscious, because the things that we need to do in order to survive and produce the next generation all require, or almost all require, consciousness. Some don't. You can digest when you're unconscious. But so the question, what's the evolutionary function of consciousness, is like the question, what's the evolutionary function of being able to walk, eat, find food, organize into social groups, produce our young, raise our young, fight off illness, defend ourselves from our enemies, and do all the other things that are necessary for survival. Now, I think there are left over some interesting questions about which things are conscious that are important for our evolution and which things are not conscious. So, for example, the discrimination of colors through vision plays an important role in our getting through life because we then have powers of discrimination which vastly exceed those of unconscious but light-sensitive organisms, such as the phototropic characters of certain plants. Okay, so there are still specific questions. Now, the color vision is different from digestion because digestion, the digestive processes are mostly unconscious. So there will be an interesting discussion in evolutionary biology about which of our phenotypical traits that enable us to survive are conscious and which are not. But the question, the skeptical question that suggests, well, there's really no evolutionary point to consciousness, that does not seem to me a serious proposal. And once again, I think we are inclined to make that mistake because we're accepting dualism. We think, well, the mental isn't really part of the physical world, so you can easily subtract the mental and leave the rest of the world intact. And the answer is, for people like us, you can't. If we're unconscious, we can't cope. I mean, just think of what it is for someone to be in a coma or for someone to be otherwise unconscious, and you'll see that the ability to cope with life and society requires consciousness. All right, but now then, that takes us to our seventh problem. Well, all the same, doesn't any causal account of the type that you've been proposing, doesn't that put you back in bed with Descartes, where you've been trying to get out of all this time? Aren't you then stuck with dualism? Because what you said was, you got the physical causes in the form of brain processes and the mental event in the form of the effect, and that's dualism all over again, because you got the physical or material base that gives rise to a mental or spiritual or psychological effect, and that's dualism, and we're trying to avoid dualism because it didn't work. We tried it for centuries, it was a failure. I think this mistake comes from taking another philosopher too seriously, and that's David Hume. Most people are in the grip of philosophers whose names they never heard of, like Descartes and Hume and Kant and Aristotle, or if they have heard of them, they can't pronounce the name properly or can't spell it. I mean, many of my students still want to say Descartes. But in any case, what Hume did was give us the idea that all causation is a matter of discrete events in time. First you have the cause, the victim got shot, and then you have the effect, the victim died. There's first the cause, then the effect. It's a series of discrete events. Well, that's true for a lot of causes, but there are a lot of causal relations in nature that aren't like that. Think, for example, of the pressure of the furniture in this room on the floor. That's not a separate event. That's a continuing state, and that is caused by the force of gravity. And gravity, again, is not a separate event. It is a continuing force in the world. And I mentioned in earlier lectures, and want to repeat now, there are all sorts of explanations that are bottom-up explanations, where by bottom-up I mean, the metaphor is not all that useful, but it's very common, so I'm using it. By bottom-up, I mean we explain the behavior of big things in terms of the behavior of little things. We explain the surface phenomena of a system, such as its transparency or its liquidity or its solidity, in terms of the behavior of the micro elements. And once again, that's not event causation, because that's a continuing state of the system. The system continues to be in a state of solidity or liquidity as long as the molecules continue to behave appropriately. So it seems to me once we get over the idea that all causation is a matter of discrete events following sequentially in time, we can see there's no dualism of mind and body implicit in the idea that at one and the same time, the brain processes cause consciousness. That is to say, neuron firings at synapses cause consciousness, but consciousness is itself a higher level physical feature of the system. Consciousness is both caused by and realized in the system of neurons. Well, but the next argument says, and now we're up to number 8, haven't you got reductionism? I mean, in the end, mustn't an account of consciousness, an honest-to-John scientific account, be a reductionist account? Because that's what science is. Science is reductionist. We get rid of sunsets. We showed the sun doesn't really set. It's entirely explained by the rotation of the Earth on its axis, the appearance of the sunset. And we give reductionist accounts of solidity and liquidity or life itself. We reduce them to more basic processes until we reach the ultimate level of the micro-physical processes, the quantum level processes. We reduce everything to that in the end, and so we get rid of consciousness. Wouldn't a scientific account of consciousness just get rid of it, the way science got rid of sunsets by showing it was just an illusion? Now, I wish I had an hour to talk about reductionism, because it's one of the most confused notions in science and philosophy. And I went through the literature and I found literally half a dozen different meanings of the notion of reductionism. And I don't have time to explain all of that now, so let me just say the basic point, which is this. We need to distinguish those reductionist accounts which are eliminative, which eliminate the thing you are reducing, from those which give a causal explanation but don't eliminate it. Sunsets are a good example of an eliminative reduction because, of course, the sun doesn't literally set. That is an illusion created by the rotation of the Earth. But not all reductions are eliminative. Some just give a causal explanation. The causal explanation of solidity, in terms of the fact that the molecules are moving in lattice structures in vibratory motions, that doesn't get rid of solidity, it just explains it. And what I'm suggesting is a scientific account of consciousness won't eliminate it for a very simple reason. You can't eliminate anything that actually exists, and consciousness actually exists. Now, why can't we do the appearance-reality distinction for consciousness as we did for sunsets? Well, that's a very deep point, and the point is where the existence of consciousness is concerned, the appearance is the reality. If it seems to me that I'm conscious, then I am conscious. Whereas if it seems to me that the sun is setting, it doesn't follow that the sun is setting. A final question, and that was information processing. Shouldn't we go back to our old friend, the digital computer, or some other information processing system to find our proper model for consciousness? Well, we all know the answer to that by now. Information processing names an observer-relative phenomenon, except for those few cases where I'm actually thinking about something, about how to get to the airport or how to file my income tax, which are conscious acts of information processing. The sort of information processing that goes on in computers is entirely observer-relative. Consciousness is observer-independent. We will not give an account of consciousness. We won't give an analysis or a definition or a reduction of consciousness to something which is observer relative, because consciousness is intrinsic. Consciousness is something we have intrinsically. Okay, this lecture will have seemed polemical, but I want to conclude on an optimistic note. We're in a very exciting time. It is quite possible that within the lifetime of people who are already born today, we will understand the most important question outstanding in the biological sciences. How does the brain do it? How does the brain cause all of the enormous variety of our conscious life? And we're actually making progress toward that at this very moment.